The Chicago Bears had a very disappointing 2024 season, but after a very aggressive offseason so far, it looks like the Chicago Bears might actually become playoff contenders in 2025. So in this video, I want to talk about the Chicago Bears and why I personally believe they could be playoff contenders in this upcoming season. Subscribe if you're new, let's hop into it. So as I mentioned, 2024 was not really the greatest season for the Chicago Bears. They went 5-12, and overall the year was pretty lackluster, mainly on the offensive end. This is via teamrankings.com. You can see right here the average points per game they scored was 18.2, which is just not really a competitive number in today's league, which is 28th worst. Only averaged 283.5 yards per game, which was dead last in the NFL. 2.1 touchdowns per game, which was 24th. And even on the defensive end, things were not pretty either. They gave up the 14th most points per game, the 27th most yards per game, and the 30th most opponents' yards per play. You can see on the defensive side of things here, things really weren't pretty for their run defense. They ranked 25th in opponent rushing play percentage, 27th in opponents' yards per rush, 22nd in opponents' rushes per game. You guys get the gist here. They were really not that good against the run. And then offensively speaking, they really couldn't run the ball that effectively. And then passing the ball wise, it wasn't that pretty either. So inevitably, when this type of stuff does happen, there's going to be blame put really on two people, the head coach and the quarterback. Obviously, the head coach is now gone. You now bring in Ben Johnson, who I think is a great offensive coordinator, and I think will do wonders for this offense. But then a lot of the blame also does go on your quarterback, which of course was Caleb Williams. And in some ways, I think it's somewhat justified because I didn't think that Caleb Williams played particularly great in certain games. But I also thought at times he showed the flashes of what ultimately made him the #1 pick. Now, I think the biggest narrative that does go on with Caleb Williams sometimes isn't necessarily in good faith. A lot of times people complain about Caleb Williams because of his personality, the fact he paints his nails, stuff like that. Obviously, we know those people who do complain about that stuff, most of the time they don't have the most sane opinions when it comes to certain NFL teams and certain NFL players. So I typically don't really care about what those people have to say. From what I saw of Caleb Williams, there was a lot of really good moments, but also a lot of really bad moments. This team also last year it kind of felt a little bit top heavy, where the defense had some really good players, but it lacked certain depth in certain positions. The offense had really good skill players like DJ Moore, Odunze, and Keenan Allen, but then you looked at the offensive line and it was just really bad. And I feel like ever since this offseason began, the whole identity of what this team has been trying to build has been building the trenches, adding to your offensive line, adding to your defensive line, bringing in an offensive-minded head coach like Ben Johnson, who's going to bring in that Detroit Lions style football where you're going to be aggressive, you're going to build with your line, and you're going to work off of that. And that's what I felt like this Bears team should have been doing all along. I think Caleb Williams came into last year with sort of an uphill battle to accomplish. The offensive line was really bad, and yes, you had some really good weapons, but when you have a terrible offensive line and not to mention a defensive-minded head coach, you're really going to put yourself in a situation where it's going to be quite difficult to have success. I also do believe that if you look at what those numbers say, a lot of those numbers could also be attributed to the fact that they fired their head coach mid-season, and well, after the firing of Matt Eberflus, the defense just went down the tube and it was god-awful to end the season. And the offense really didn't take that much of a step forward either, even though I thought Caleb Williams was looking better towards the back end of the season. The defense obviously just wasn't good enough. So then that brings me to this most recent free agency, where so far they've been extremely aggressive in fixing up a lot of their core issues from last season. This is via PFF. They signed Dayo Odeyingbo to play opposite of Montez Sweat. You bring in Grady Jarrett to pair next to Gervon Dexter in the interior of your defensive line. You signed Drew Dowman to fix up your center spot, Durham Smythe to be more of a depth option, Jonah Jackson, Joe Thuney, not to mention Alamai Zacchaeus. Like, this team has been unbelievably aggressive in fixing their core issues from last season. So now you look at this current depth chart for the Chicago Bears, and we're going to begin with the offensive side of things. We'll talk about what I like about the offense and what I still think needs some improvement. Obviously, Caleb Williams is going to be your starting quarterback next year. And if we do assume that in his sophomore season with an improved offensive line, with maybe some more continuity in this system and building with Ben Johnson and building rapport with more of his teammates like Rome Odunze and stuff, I think this team will start to look better on the offensive end from what they looked like last year. Again, last year, the offense was just a little bit too inconsistent. They'd have a couple good plays here and there, and then some weird plays here and there as well. So I think with Ben Johnson, there will be more consistency. There will be a system put in place for Caleb Williams to really improve his game and feel confident playing his sort of style. This is going to be a system that's going to be reliant on running backs, heavy play action, bootlegs, moving the pocket, just putting Caleb Williams in very easy situations where he doesn't have to take too much time making crazy reads. And I think that's kind of where Caleb Williams is ultimately going to play really well in. Again, this is Ben Johnson, who was working with Jared Goff, and as good of a quarterback as Jared Goff is, and as talented as he was coming out of college, I think it's somewhat fair to say that Caleb Williams, as a pure talent and as a pure prospect, was a better prospect slash talent than Jared Goff ever was, especially when he got to the Detroit Lions. I mean, Caleb Williams has all the talent in the world to be a fantastic player. I think he's very good. So I think under Ben Johnson, we're just going to see him flourish next year and just get better every single year. And then you look at the running back room. I think this is probably the one spot where I think this is maybe a drastic need here. You do have DeAndre Swift, who I know had an okay season last year, but I do want to find an upgrade here. I just don't think that Roschon Johnson or Travis Homer could really be the long-term answer for this running back position. So I want to ideally draft somebody within the first round or second round. They do have 3 picks through the first 2 rounds, so I'm sure they'll probably take a running back at that point. Receiving wise, DJ Moore is a star. Rome Odunze, I think, should take a big step forward next year with his expanded role. I guess we'll see about receiver 3. Alamai Zaccheaus is a good, capable wide receiver 3. But if you can find an upgrade there in the draft, I definitely do think that you should, take a shot at it. The other thing, too, is that the backups like Tyler Scott, John Jackson, Samori Tor, Maurice Alexander, those guys are not capable enough players to realistically get a lot of playing time, so they probably should be aggressive in drafting maybe 1 or 2 receivers in the later portion of the draft. Cole Kmet is still on the roster, but it feels like every single couple months we get a new report that they're shopping him around, so we'll wait and see on that one, but I think he should be on the roster next year. And then here's the offensive line: Braxton Jones, Joe Thuney, Drew Dowman, Jonah Jackson, Darnell Wright. Again, last year this was a team that had one of, if not the worst offensive lines in the entire NFL. They were consistently not putting Caleb Williams in good situations. Now you have a bunch of new veterans like Drew Dowman, Joe Thuney. You bring in Jonah Jackson, who some of those guys, like Jonah Jackson, have some familiarity to what Ben Johnson does. And then I just think that all in all, you're going to be getting the best out of these guys. You have Darnell Wright, who was a top 10 pick a few years ago. Braxton Jones is technically still a starter, but I wouldn't take it out of the possibility that they draft a tackle in this year's draft as well, like an Armand Membu, Will Campbell, Kelvin Banks, to just kind of finalize this offensive line for this year and for the future. Even if you don't take a tackle and you rock with Braxton Jones, I feel really confident this offensive line should take a drastic step forward next year. You bring in, some really good players. Drew Dowman, I think, was the best center available in free agency, and they bring him in. He's a great run blocker and I think a capable pass blocker. Jonah Jackson, when healthy, is a very solid guard. And then, of course, Joe Thuney, or Joe Tooney, however you say it, is somebody who is a all-pro caliber type of guard. So you're building a solid interior offensive line and you feel okay about your tackle spots. Obviously, we'll see about the left tackle spot, but man, I feel really, really solid about where this offense stands right now. Again, I think running back is a big need for them. I would like to see Ashton Genty or Amarian Hampton or Caleb Johnson or even like a Quinshot Judkins or somebody like that added to this offense, because I think it would just give this offense some more energy, especially because this is Ben Johnson, who last year had David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. I know DeAndre Swift probably isn't as good as Gibbs, but you can use Swift as sort of like a Jahmyr Gibbs-like role, and then you can fill in David Montgomery's role with maybe like an Ashton Genty, who obviously doesn't play like him, but hypothetically speaking, maybe like that, or Caleb Johnson, who I think might be a bit more like that. So again, I think offensively speaking, this team should take a big step forward next year from a personnel standpoint, but also from a schematic standpoint too. Which then brings me over to the defensive side of things, which again, last year, the defense was a little bit disappointing. Now, I want to make it clear that I thought after the firing of Eberflus, the defense took a big step back. But this team has been aggressive in adding pieces to where they really needed to add pieces. You feel okay about your secondary. Jalen Johnson, Jaquan Brisker, Kevin Byard, who had a really good year last year, by the way, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon. It's a young, consistently improving secondary that you feel really confident in moving forward. Your linebackers, you have continuity here. You bring back Amen, you have TJ Edwards, Tremaine Edmonds, Noah Sewell. Maybe you want to add some depth options, or maybe somebody to kind of fill in the role for Noah here, but maybe that's what Amen can do. So all in all, you feel pretty decent about your linebacking core. Wouldn't take it out of the possibility of drafting a linebacker to fill in kind of a depth option, but that's not that big of a need. But the defensive line has seen some big time upgrades. Obviously, Montez Sweat didn't look like the greatest last year, but I think Montez Sweat, now that he has some help around him, should be having a really good season next year. You bring in Grady Jarrett, who at this stage of his career is not the same guy that he was maybe 3-4 years ago, but still is very capable, is a good run stuffer, can get some pressure on the quarterback, just still a really solid disruptor up the middle. And you pair him, who's an older veteran, with some young guys like Gervon Dexter and Andrew Billings and Zach Pickens and some of these other young guys. Gervon Dexter obviously had a pretty decent season last year, so you feel pretty good about the interior. Again, I wouldn't take it out of the possibility of drafting somebody else in the second, third, or fourth round to just add even more depth and more young options for the future. But again, that's not really that big of a need for them. Then you also bring in Dayo Odeyingbo, who statistically speaking maybe isn't like the most impressive player in the world. Like last year only had 3 sacks, played in 17 games. The year prior, 8 sacks, 5 sacks in 2022. But to me, Dayo is somebody who's extremely young and just consistently improving. The statistics will get there at some point. The productivity is there on paper. It's also there in the film. I just really enjoyed watching him play football. Really good disruptive guy, good pass rusher, also really good against the run. Pair that up with Montez Sweat, Grady Jarrett, and Gervon Dexter, and I do think this defensive line is getting insanely better. Austin Booker's also there, who's a developing edge rusher who you had last year, who didn't really do a whole bunch, but again, you want to see him take the big step forward in these couple years. And I also wouldn't take it out of the equation of them potentially even drafting an edge rusher in this upcoming draft to, add even more fuel to what the defensive line could be. I don't know who it might be. Maybe Nick Scourton, if he falls to the second round, could be a possibility, or somebody along those lines who you just feel confident can be a disruptor. There are some pretty solid pass rushers in the second round. So if you are Chicago, maybe you take running back in rounds 1 and 2, or offensive line with one of those picks. And again, you have 3 picks in the first 2 rounds. So maybe with one of those picks, you take an edge rusher. So all in all, do I think the Chicago Bears can make the playoffs next year? Yes. Now here is the ultimate obstacle they're going to have to come. The NFC in general is pretty loaded, and there's a lot of really good teams. We'll go division by division, and I'll tell you who I think could potentially become, playoff contenders next year. You look at the Commanders, I feel like they're pretty much a lock to make the playoffs next year, barring a huge sophomore slump from Jaden Daniels. The Eagles won the Super Bowl this year. They're probably a lock. Giants, Cowboys, bit more question marks, but I could see one of those 2 teams potentially making it in there depending on what happens with the quarterback room for the New York Giants. I think the Cowboys could make it, but I don't know. It just depends on their injuries, depends on if the coaching staff is good. So from the NFC East, you're looking at 2 to 3 teams making the playoffs. Then you have the NFC South, and then you have the Falcons, who you expect to take a big step forward next year. The Buccaneers, who I think could also make the playoffs, although they're kind of a bit more of a question mark with how good the NFC is. The Panthers, maybe they could get in there if they have a big breakout year in year 3 with Bryce Young. And then the Saints, probably not, unless Kellen Moore can really just work some magic. Then the NFC West, you have the Arizona Cardinals, who I think are having a fantastic offseason, and I think they could be in the conversation next year. The LA Rams, I think they're probably a lock to make the playoffs. 49ers are a bit more of a question mark because they have some really good players still on the roster, but they also have lost a lot of really good players, so I'll leave them as a question mark. And then there's Seattle, who I think is also a question mark, but I think if they can hit the right notes and play their version of football they want to play, I think they could as well. And then, of course, the NFC North, the division in which the Chicago Bears are in, I think every single one of these teams are really close to being playoff locks. Like Detroit's probably a lock. Minnesota is maybe not a lock until we see what JJ McCarthy looks like, but roster and talent-wise, it could be considered a lock right now. And I'd also say with Green Bay, with Jordan Love and Matt LaFleur, I'd probably say they're a lock as well. So for Chicago, you have a lot of competition in the NFC and within your own division at that. So it's going to be difficult to not only make the playoffs by winning the division, but also just by making it from a wild card's perspective. Because I could see a hypothetical world where every team in the NFC North gets 10 wins. I think there's a couple teams in the East, a couple teams in the South, and maybe a couple teams in the West that could be notching 9-10 wins and be pushing for a wild card spot. And again, there's only 7 spots in the playoffs, so if you're a team like Chicago, I think you have to be clicking early on, and you can't have a slow start to your season, kind of like what they had last year. But I believe that if Chicago can step out of the gates, play at a high level early on, compete, and maybe within the first 8 weeks go like 5-3 or 6-2 or something along those lines, and then I think that it's pretty safe to say that Chicago's well on their way to making the playoffs. Although we did see last year Chicago had a great start and then they kind of fell off a cliff to end the season. I don't expect that next year because I do believe in Ben Johnson and I believe in the development of Caleb Williams, but of course you just never know. Ultimately speaking though, do I think Chicago will make the playoffs? I think they have a good shot at it. I'm not going to definitively say they will because there's a lot of good teams in the NFC, but I love the moves they've made. If we expect Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams to work their magic, I don't see a way they couldn't get in the playoffs. But again, you just never know in the NFC. A lot of really good teams, and for Chicago, they've been a little bit inconsistent at times. They've been offseason warriors in the past, and it hasn't always worked out the greatest for them. So I won't say definitively that they will, but I will say I think there's a very, very good shot they ultimately do so. But you guys let me know in the comment section below. Do you guys think Chicago will make the playoffs next year? Let me know.